The late afternoon sun bathed Central Park in a soft, golden glow, casting long shadows over the winding pathways. The gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze harmonized with the distant sounds of life, children's laughter, the rhythmic beat of joggers' feet, and the occasional bark of an eager dog. It was a scene of serene vibrancy, yet amidst it all, Sarah Mitchell sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, her face tilted toward the warmth of the sun. For Sarah, this bench was more than just a place to rest, it was her anchor in a world she couldn't see but had come to understand in other ways. The light breeze carried the earthy scent of damp soil, mingling with the sweetness of blooming flowers and the faint, tantalizing aroma of hot dogs from a nearby stand. Her fingers absent-mindedly ran along the braided leather leash in her lap, connecting her to Bud, her guide dog and steadfast companion. Bud sat at her feet, his muscular frame taut with silent vigilance. His ears flicked at every sound, the flutter of wings, the chatter of passing strangers, the distant clink of a cyclist's bell. While Sarah felt a rare moment of peace, Bud remained attuned to the world around them, his every movement a subtle expression of his readiness to protect. Sarah's outward calm masked the complex emotions swirling within her. There was a quiet joy in feeling the sun on her skin, the wind brushing her face, and the grounding presence of Bud by her side. Yet, beneath the surface lingered a subtle ache, a longing for the freedom she once took for granted, a freedom now tethered to the instincts of her loyal companion. This moment in the park felt like a reprieve, a bubble of stillness in an otherwise challenging life. But as the minutes stretched on, Sarah's thoughts began to wander, and a faint unease crept into her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. She gripped Bud's leash a little tighter, as if seeking reassurance. Bud, ever perceptive, glanced up at her, his amber eyes filled with an almost human understanding. It was as if he, too, sensed that the tranquility of this afternoon was fragile, a fleeting moment before the arrival of something unknown. The serenity of the park was shattered by a sharp, panicked scream that cut through the air like a knife. Sarah jolted, her heart leaping into her throat as the sound echoed in her ears. It came from somewhere nearby, too close for comfort. Bud immediately rose to his feet, his body rigid and alert. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Sarah rarely heard from him but had come to understand as a sign of danger. She tightened her grip on his leash, her pulse quickening as adrenaline coursed through her veins. "Bud, steady," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. The sounds of hurried footsteps followed, thudding against the pavement, erratic and uneven. Someone was running, and the panic in their movements was unmistakable. Sarah strained to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. "Help! Please, someone stop him," a woman's voice cried, her words ragged and desperate. Sarah felt a surge of helplessness. She turned her head toward the commotion, relying on the heightened sensitivity of her other senses. The faint scent of sweat and leather reached her, a man running past, his presence a blur of sound and motion. Bud barked sharply, his instincts urging him to give chase, but Sarah pulled back on the leash. Her mind raced. She wanted to help, but how? She couldn't see the fleeing figure, couldn't pinpoint the danger beyond the raw urgency in the woman's voice. "Stop! He took my bag," the woman shouted again, her voice growing fainter as the thief increased his distance. Sarah's grip on Bud's leash tightened. Her hands trembled, caught between the instinct to act and the fear of stepping into an unknown and potentially dangerous situation. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "Bud, forward," she commanded firmly, her voice steadier now. The dog obeyed, guiding her in the direction of the fleeing man. Sarah's heart pounded as they moved, her other senses compensating for her lack of sight. She could hear the thief's hurried steps ahead and the faint jingle of something metallic, perhaps a zipper or a keyring. "Stop him," someone else yelled, their voice distant and strained. Then, Bud suddenly halted, his body tense as he barked once more. Sarah felt a tug on the leash, and she knew something, or someone, was directly in their path. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm but cautious. There was a pause, a ragged breath, and then a deep voice growled, "Move out of my way, lady." Sarah's blood ran cold. The man's tone was sharp, laced with impatience and menace. She tightened her grip on Bud's leash, her mind racing for a solution. She was standing between the thief and his escape, but what could she do now? The tension in the air was palpable, the moment stretching as if suspended in time. Sarah braced herself, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make, a choice that could define not only this moment but the strength she carried within herself. The man's sharp voice hung in the air, a threat that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She tightened her grip on Bud's leash, her heart pounding as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. But Bud didn't flinch. Instead, he stood firm, his body coiled with tension, every muscle ready for action. Sarah could feel his energy through the leash, a silent communication born of trust and years of training. "Bud," Sarah commanded softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Guard." With a deep, resonant bark, Bud lunged forward, cutting the air between Sarah and the man. The growl that followed was low and guttural, a sound that made it clear Bud was not to be underestimated. "Whoa, whoa," the man stammered, his bravado cracking. She could hear him shuffle backward, his confidence faltering in the face of Bud's unyielding presence. "Drop whatever you took," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed. The man hesitated, but Bud took another step forward, his bark sharper this time. The leash trembled in Sarah's hand as she felt Bud's focus lock onto the threat, his every move calculated and precise. "You're bluffing," the man muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Try me," Sarah shot back, her grip tightening on the leash. "Bud's trained to protect, and he won't hesitate if you make the wrong move." Bud let out another growl, his teeth bared now, and Sarah could almost hear the thief's resolve crumbling. There was a clatter as something hit the pavement, a purse, its contents spilling out across the ground. Sarah exhaled sharply, relief mingling with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Good boy, Bud," she whispered, her voice soft but full of pride. "Now, get out of here," Sarah said, her tone unyielding. The man didn't need to be told twice. His footsteps pounded against the pavement, growing fainter as he fled. Sarah bent down, running her hands over the ground until she felt the strap of the purse. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against scattered items, keys, a phone, a wallet. Is that my bag?" the woman's voice called out, breathless and tentative. "Yes," Sarah replied, holding it up. She heard the woman approach, her steps hurried but grateful. "Oh, thank you. I don't know what I would have done if," the woman trailed off, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's okay," Sarah said gently, handing the bag over. "Bud and I were happy to help." The woman knelt beside her, tears in her voice as she said, "You're amazing. Both of you." As the woman walked away, her voice still full of gratitude, Sarah knelt beside Bud, running her fingers through his fur. "Good boy," she whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Bud wagged his tail, his job done, his loyalty unshaken. Together, they stood in the quiet park, the conflict behind them but the bond between them stronger than ever. The park seemed eerily quiet in the aftermath, the adrenaline fading but leaving Sarah's senses heightened. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on Bud's head, when the sound of sirens broke the stillness. A police car pulled up near the entrance, its lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, their presence authoritative but calm. Sarah could hear the crunch of their boots on the gravel path as they approached. "Ma'am, we got a report of a disturbance in the park," one of them said. His voice was steady, professional. Sarah turned toward the sound, holding Bud's leash firmly. "It's under control now," she replied. The man fled, but he dropped the stolen purse. "I've already returned it to the owner." The officer nodded, his tone softening. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" "No," Sarah assured him. Bud made sure of that. The second officer chuckled lightly, noticing Bud's attentive stance. "Looks like you've got yourself a real partner there." Sarah smiled faintly, her hand brushing through Bud's fur. "He's the best." As Sarah recounted the events, the officers took notes, occasionally exchanging glances of approval. The woman whose purse had been stolen returned, her voice steady now but still filled with gratitude. I can confirm everything she said, the woman added. If it weren't for her and her dog, she trailed off, her voice breaking again. We'll make sure the report reflects that, the first officer said kindly. He turned back to Sarah. Thank you for your quick thinking. You might have prevented something worse from happening tonight. The officers stayed a while longer, ensuring there was no immediate danger before departing to search for the thief. The woman lingered as well, insisting on exchanging contact information with Sarah. I owe you more than I can say, she said, her voice soft but resolute. If there's ever anything I can do to repay you. You don't owe me anything, Sarah replied gently. Just stay safe. As the woman walked away, Bud nudged Sarah's leg, his tail wagging lightly. The tension in the air had dissolved, leaving only a sense of quiet accomplishment. But as they began to head home, Sarah couldn't shake the lingering weight of the encounter. She'd faced a moment of real danger, and though she was proud of Bud and herself, she also felt a flicker of unease. What if the man had been armed? What if Bud had been hurt? Come on, boy, she murmured, trying to push the thoughts aside. Bud's steady presence at her side was enough to remind her of their bond, their trust. Later that night, as she sat on the couch with Bud resting his head in her lap, Sarah reflected on everything. Bud had proven himself not just as a loyal companion, but as a protector. And she had discovered something within herself, a courage she didn't know she had. But she also realized that the world could be unpredictable and dangerous. Maybe it was time to rethink a few things. Training for Bud had always been a way to help him thrive. Now, she wondered if it was time to train herself, too, to prepare for the unexpected in a world that didn't always play fair. As she scratched behind Bud's ears, she whispered, "We're a team, Bud. And no matter what comes next, we've got this." Bud wagged his tail in response, and for the first time that evening, Sarah allowed herself to truly relax, knowing they'd face whatever the future held together. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a lingering sense of curiosity. Bud had always been special, his intelligence, his responsiveness, the way he seemed to understand her every emotion. Last night's events only deepened the mystery. Where had he learned to act with such precision? As she poured her coffee, her eyes fell on Bud, sprawled lazily on the kitchen floor, his tail thumping softly against the tiles. "What's your story, boy?" she mused aloud, smiling. Later that day, Sarah decided to take a closer look at the paperwork she'd received when she adopted Bud. She rummaged through the drawer in her living room, eventually pulling out the slightly crumpled folder from the animal shelter. Flipping through the documents, she noticed something she hadn't paid much attention to before, a stamp reading, "Transferred from Greenridge K-9 Academy," on one of the forms. "Greenridge K-9 Academy," she muttered. It didn't sound like a typical shelter or rescue organization. Intrigued, Sarah opened her laptop and began searching online. Within minutes, she found the academy's website. It was a prestigious training facility for police and military dogs, known for producing highly skilled K-9 units. Sarah's heart raced as she scrolled through the photos and descriptions of their programs. Could Bud have been part of something like this? She reached for her phone and dialed the academy's number, her curiosity outweighing any hesitation. A cheerful receptionist answered after a few rings. "Greenridge K-9 Academy, how can I help you?" "Hi," Sarah began, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I recently adopted a dog from a shelter, and I noticed a note saying he was transferred from your academy. His name is Bud. I was wondering if you might have any information about him?" There was a brief pause before the receptionist responded, "Let me check our records. Do you happen to know his ID number or microchip details?" Sarah quickly read off the numbers from Bud's adoption papers. There was silence on the other end as the receptionist typed. "Yes, here he is," she said after a moment. "Bud, originally named Bravo. He was part of our advanced tactical training program." Sarah's breath caught. "Tactical training? You mean, like a police dog?" "Exactly," the receptionist confirmed. "He was one of our top trainees. exceptional obedience, excellent problem-solving skills, and a natural instinct for protection. Unfortunately, he was retired early. Retired? Why? Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. The receptionist's tone softened. During his final evaluations, Bud showed signs of anxiety in high-pressure environments. It wasn't severe, but it meant he wasn't suited for deployment in active service. We worked with a shelter to ensure he found a loving home where he could thrive. Sarah glanced over at Bud, who was now sitting up, watching her with those soulful eyes as if sensing he was the topic of conversation. "Thank you so much for the information," Sarah said, her mind racing. "This explains a lot." After hanging up, Sarah sat quietly for a moment, processing everything. Bud's sharp instincts, his quick response to danger, the way he always seemed so attuned to his surroundings, it all made sense now. He wasn't just a smart dog, he was trained to be extraordinary. Later that evening, as Sarah sat with Bud in the living room, she couldn't help but feel a new sense of admiration for him. She gently stroked his fur, her voice soft. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" she whispered. "You've already done your share of protecting the world. Now it's my turn to protect you." Bud looked up at her, his tail wagging as if to say he understood. From that moment on, Sarah felt an even deeper connection to Bud. He wasn't just her companion, he was her partner, her protector, and now, her greatest inspiration. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they'd face them together, with a bond forged not just by love but by trust and understanding. A few weeks after Sarah discovered Bud's extraordinary past, she received an unexpected call from Greenridge Canine Academy. The familiar voice of the receptionist greeted her warmly. "Hi, Ms. Carter. I hope this isn't a bad time. I was reviewing Bud's, Bravo's files, and I noticed a note about his former handler. His name is Daniel Hayes. He's been asking about Bravo recently. Would you be open to reconnecting them?" Sarah hesitated, glancing over at Bud, who was lounging near the fireplace. Reconnecting? Daniel was Bud's trainer and handler for almost 2 years. The two of them were inseparable, but when Bud was retired, it was out of Daniel's hands. He's been trying to find out what happened to him ever since. Sarah's heart ached at the thought of Bud and his handler being separated, but she also felt a twinge of protectiveness. Bud was part of her life now, and the idea of sharing him, even with someone from his past, was daunting. "I'd like to meet Daniel first," Sarah finally said. "To make sure it's the right thing for Bud." "Of course," the receptionist replied. "I'll pass along your contact information, and Daniel can reach out." A week later, Sarah found herself sitting on a park bench, Bud lying faithfully at her feet. She looked up as a tall man approached, his uniformed posture unmistakable despite the casual clothes he wore. His sandy brown hair was streaked with gray, and his face carried a mix of anticipation and vulnerability. "Ms. Carter?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Yes," Sarah replied, standing to shake his hand. "You must be Daniel." Daniel's eyes immediately fell on Bud, softening. "Bravo," he murmured. Bud's ears perked up at the sound of his old name, and his head tilted as if trying to place it. "He still recognizes you," Sarah said, watching as Bud hesitated before standing, his tail wagging cautiously. Daniel knelt, holding out his hand. "Hey, there, buddy. It's me." Bud stepped forward, sniffing Daniel's hand before leaning into him, his tail wagging furiously now. The reunion was as heartwarming as it was bittersweet. Daniel hugged Bud tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped wondering where you ended up," Daniel said softly, looking up at Sarah. "He was the best partner I ever had." Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she watched the bond between them. "He's an incredible dog," she said. "He's been my rock these past few months." Daniel nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and longing. "I'm glad he's with someone who loves him as much as he deserves." Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Sarah developed a rhythm. Daniel visited regularly, always bringing treats and spending time with Bud. Sarah watched as Bud's confidence blossomed even further. Daniel shared stories of their time together, of the missions they trained for and the obstacles they overcame. But it was clear that Bud's life with Sarah was what he needed now. The tension and pressure of his past were behind him, replaced by the warmth and comfort of a home. One afternoon, as the three of them sat in Sarah's backyard, Daniel broke the silence. "I can see he's happy here," he said. "You've given him something I couldn't, a chance to just be a dog." Sarah smiled. "He's given me just as much. I can't imagine life without him." Daniel nodded, his eyes on Bud as the dog playfully chased a squirrel. "You're exactly where you're meant to be, buddy," he said quietly. Though their lives had taken different paths, Daniel and Bud's bond remained unbroken. And in Sarah, Daniel found not just someone who loved Bud, but a friend who understood what made him so special. Together, they honored Bud's past while embracing the life he'd built in the present, a life filled with love, adventure, and the unshakable loyalty of a truly remarkable dog. After learning about Bud's past and witnessing the emotional reunion with Daniel, Sarah realized just how much her dog had endured before finding a home with her. While Bud had adjusted remarkably well to civilian life, subtle signs of his old habits and lingering instincts began to surface, behaviors Sarah now recognized as remnants of his intense training. At first, it was little things, Bud snapping to attention at loud sounds or intently scanning his surroundings during their evening walks. He was protective, always placing himself between Sarah and strangers, even when they posed no threat. His energy levels on some days were boundless, leaving Sarah wondering if he missed the structured routines of his former life. She knew she had to adapt, not only to meet Bud's physical needs but to help him mentally unwind from the pressures he once faced. Sarah reached out to Daniel for advice. "He seems restless some days," she admitted during one of their chats. "Like he's searching for something to do." Daniel nodded knowingly. "It's in his nature. These dogs are trained to stay alert and ready. Without a task, they can feel lost. It's important to give him jobs, even small ones, to keep his mind engaged." Taking Daniel's advice to heart, Sarah began incorporating new activities into Bud's daily routine. She taught him to carry small items around the house, like her keys or the mail. On their walks, she added games of hide-and-seek, hiding treats along their route for Bud to sniff out. Bud thrived under the added structure. His tail wagged with enthusiasm as he completed each task, his sharp mind clearly enjoying the challenges Sarah set for him. While Bud embraced his new life, some of his ingrained behaviors were harder to ease. One evening, Sarah hosted a small gathering at her home, inviting a few friends over for dinner. Bud greeted them politely but remained on high alert, his eyes darting toward the door at every noise. As the night went on, Bud positioned himself at Sarah's feet, his body a protective barrier between her and the rest of the room. "Is he always like this?" one of her friends asked, noticing Bud's watchful demeanor. "Not always," Sarah replied, scratching behind Bud's ears to soothe him. "He's just protective. It's part of who he is." To help Bud relax in social settings, Sarah worked on desensitizing him to unfamiliar situations. She invited Daniel to join them during group walks, introducing Bud to new people in controlled environments. Slowly, Bud began to trust that Sarah was safe, even in the company of others. One afternoon, Sarah and Bud visited a bustling farmer's market. The crowd was thick, the air filled with the chatter of voices and the aroma of fresh produce. Bud stayed close to Sarah, his leash slack but his ears perked. When a child ran by, laughing and carrying a balloon, Bud froze for a moment, his muscles tensing. Sarah crouched down beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "It's okay, Bud," she said softly. "You're safe." Bud looked at her, his amber eyes searching hers. Slowly, he relaxed, his tail wagging tentatively. Together, they navigated the market, Sarah rewarding Bud with treats and praise for every calm interaction. As the weeks passed, Sarah and Bud settled into a rhythm that honored both his past and his new life. Their bond grew stronger with each shared moment, whether it was a quiet evening by the fire or a hike through the woods. One night, as Sarah curled up on the couch with Bud beside her, she glanced at the framed photo on the mantel, a picture of Bud and Daniel during their training days, which Daniel had given her as a gift. "You've been through so much," Sarah murmured, resting her hand on Bud's head. "But you're home now. We'll figure this out together." Bud let out a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he nestled closer to her. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like they were both exactly where they were meant to be. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself growing even closer to Bud. The journey they had embarked on together, learning about his past, adapting to his needs, and helping him find peace, had forged a bond neither of them could have anticipated. It was a connection that went beyond words, built on trust and understanding. One evening, after a long day, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Bud, now more at ease, lay beside her, his head resting on his paws. The soft breeze ruffled his fur, and Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. She had always known Bud as a loyal and protective companion, but now she saw him in a new light. His instincts, once honed for combat and survival, had softened with time and care. He was still the same dog who had served in difficult and dangerous conditions, but now he was her dog, her partner in this new chapter of life. The peace that had once seemed elusive to Bud now felt possible, and Sarah was grateful for the quiet moments they shared. One afternoon, as Sarah was cleaning out her closet, she found an old photo album she hadn't looked at in years. As she flipped through the pages, she came across a picture of her younger self, her first dog, a scrappy mutt named Bailey, whom she had adopted when she was a teenager. Memories flooded back of those simpler times, of bonding with Bailey in the same way she was now bonding with Bud. Sarah smiled softly, a thought drifting into her mind. What is strength, really? It wasn't just the moments of heroism or the survival of hardships that defined strength. It was in the quiet patience, the willingness to learn, and the ability to heal. For Bud, it was in learning to trust again, and for Sarah, it was in discovering a new way of supporting and understanding her companion. Sarah began to see how Bud had been shaped by the experiences that had come before. His sharp instincts, once seen as excessive, now seemed necessary, proof of his resilience and adaptability. She understood that his past was a crucial part of who he was, and it wasn't something to be feared or ignored. In turn, Bud began to understand Sarah's presence in a way that went deeper than the food and shelter she provided. He had learned to look to her for more than just commands and structure. He looked to her for comfort, for guidance, and for a steady hand in a world that had once felt unpredictable. One night, as Sarah watched him curl up at her feet, she realized how far they had come from the fearful, tense moments they had shared in the beginning. Bud no longer reacted to every loud noise or sudden movement with wariness. Instead, he rested with an ease that had taken time, patience, and love to cultivate. The bond between Sarah and Bud was no longer just one of owner and dog, it was one of partners, two souls who had learned to coexist and heal together. Bud's past, with all its intensity and challenges, no longer overshadowed the present. It had become a part of his story, but it wasn't the whole story. Sarah had discovered the depth of Bud's loyalty and strength, but more than that, she had discovered her own capacity for patience, understanding, and love. With each passing day, their relationship evolved, not defined by what Bud had endured but by the new memories they were creating together. And as Sarah stroked his fur, watching the last of the sunlight slip behind the horizon, she realized that sometimes, the greatest strength comes from the quiet understanding between two beings, each offering the other the chance to heal and grow. In that understanding, they had found peace, and for both Sarah and Bud, that was enough.